Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful occasion where we're launching Iain Crichton Smith's new selected poems, Deer on the High Hills. I'm extremely pleased to be introducing this, so I do wish our usual introducer, Jazz, was here to do it, because she always remembers what to say and I will probably forget. First of all, some housekeeping items. This event should last about an hour. We're going to project the text of the poems that are being read on the screen. And if you want to see the text, you can foreground the text, or you can see the speaker, whichever you prefer, or balance the two. You have a face control, or as it were, a projection control on your screen, probably at the upper right-hand corner. So you can control your display. We'd also welcome it if you would enter the chat in the chat where you're listening from, and any comments that you might have as the event progresses, and that would be welcome. And we'll share that later with the editor, with John, and with his interlocutor, Niall. I'm sure there's something else I have to mention to you. In any event, I was Iain Crichton Smith's publisher for many years, starting in 1984. And all I want to say about him is that he is probably one of the two poets that I have ever decided to publish on the strength of a reading. I went to a reading that he gave in 1983, probably in Cambridge. And I was so moved by his reading of Deer on the High Hills that I went up to him afterwards and asked him if we could publish his work. And after that, we published all of his poetry, not his stories, and with great joy. I'm really thrilled that John Greening undertook this task, because John, apart from being a wonderful poet and a wonderful anthologist, is also a great advocate. And he and I have a lot of plans, which I hope will evolve over the years, assuming we both live so long. And now we'll give him a proper introduction in just a moment. Now himself, I'm really thrilled he could join us, because he has the proper voice for Iain Crichton Smith's poems. He is from South Uist in the Western Isles of Scotland, and his inflection is really very lovely to hear. He's the author of two wonderful collections of poetry, Moontide, for which he won the first Edwin Morgan Prize, Edwin Morgan being another Carcanet poet, and the Saltire Award for the best first book. And then his more recent collection, also from Blood Axe, is Noctuary. It came out in 2019. Really thrilled that he can be here. And now I'll hand over to you now. I'll come back at the end and release you all from this magic spell. Niall.
Good evening to everybody. And just to echo that, it's a real pleasure to be part of this event, for me, celebrate two poets, Iain Crichton Smith and also John Greening as well, and what he's been doing to bring him back to the page. You sometimes think that poetry is like the sliding in and out of relevance, or sliding in and out of memory, and it's just incredible to see this book in print, bringing back what I would say is a really important poet. For me, I grew up, of course, on the Outer Hebrides, one of the Western Isles of Scotland, so the Uist rather than the Isle of Lewis, which Iain Crichton Smith was from. And I didn't know his work pretty much at all. I was just explaining, I actually came across his work really for the first time in a charity shop in Huddersfield or Honley when we lived there in 2011. And I think it was his first Carcanet book I managed to pick up there. And there's a curious thing to be, as a Campbell, introducing this Iain Crichton Smith book, if only because in the Chinese poem he has the fabulous line, "I send this to you by a small boy with a pointed head. Do not trust him. He is a Campbell." So with that, just to introduce John Greening. John, I've known for a few years now, and he might not thank me for mentioning that he's about to hit a big anniversary of 40 years publishing poetry. I think that's next year. So the Westerners was first published in 1982. His most recent collection here, The Silence by Carcanet, is an incredible book, one I enjoyed immensely. And not only is he an interesting poet, but as Michael quite rightly said there, he's an incredible advocate of other poets. And just to flag up one other book here in this Vapor Trails, where he looks at contemporary poets of England and further afield, and that's with Shoestring Press. So just to introduce John here, if he would like to come into view. The general kind of shape of the evening is John's going to be doing some readings just to begin with here, and showcase some of Iain Crichton Smith's incredible poems that I've managed to capture on the page. And then later we'll come back for some conversation, and importantly, some question and answers. I know with Zoom, it's a little bit distant and difficult rather than a traditional reading. So if you would like to put any questions, I'm on charge of the chat. So put any questions that you might have and we'll try and incorporate them into the conversation. But that is me kind of ticked off, I think, and just introduce John, and thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Message flashed up, my internet is unstable, so I hope it's not too unstable that you can hear and see me. Thank you very much, Michael and Niall, for that introduction. And it's a delight to be introducing Iain Crichton Smith's poems to you. Let's start on Lewis, and that's where so much started for Iain Crichton Smith, even though he was born in Glasgow. Many reference books get that wrong, but he was born in Glasgow, came to Lewis when he was very young. And Lewis he loved it in many ways, but also he felt there was a kind of, I think his phrase was, a hostility to the creative spirit. Didn't take too kindly to being creative there. I mean, his mother told him off for making little toy hens, complaining that God had given sort of real hens. Why would you make toys of them? So this poem, which is a signature poem really, called Poem of Lewis, comes from 1955. Here they have no time for the fine graces of poetry, unless it freely grows in deep compulsion, like water in the well, woven into the texture of the soil in a strong pattern. They have no rhymes to tailor the material of thought and snap the thread quickly on the tooth. One would have thought that this black north was used to lightning, crossing the sky like fish, swift in their element. One would have thought the barren rock would give a value to the bursting flower. The two extremes, mourning and gaiety, meet like north and south in the one breast, milked by knuckled time, till dryness spreads across each aging bone. They have no place for the fine graces of poetry. The great forgiving spirit of the word, fanning its rainbow wing like a shot bird, falls from the windy sky. The sea heaves in visionless anger over the cramped graves, and the early daffodil, purer than a soul, is gathered into the terrible mouth of the gale. And there's that pun on gale at the end there. He does use a lot of wordplay in his early poetry. And so there's that sort of darker, denser Iain Crichton Smith, but there's also the lighter writer. And he saw occasionally glimmerings of glorious things from Lewis too. So I want to include some of that. This poem, which is not in his collected actually, I found quite a few poems that, because he wrote so many that were never collected, called Lilac, Snow and Shadow. He loved colour, and perhaps because there's so much black around him, all the elders and the widows on Lewis. A lilac dress casting a long shadow on a patch of bright snow. The skies pass by in blue marching. Oh dear, my country, that you give me these, lilac on snow, the urgent, turbulent skies, me walking at ease, the supple air inhaling. Oh dear, my island with the seas around you, I kneel this moment to the innumerable dead who have fed dense waters and the blue Aprils, for these simplicities of a complex air, a lilac dress, the snow, the blue sky marching, myself of 100 colours swarming there. Well, Michael mentioned the title poem, Deer on the High Hills, and what a marvellous poem it is. He wrote it after giving a reading in Glasgow. He was driving back and these deer came down. So they're actual deer in the poem, but they're also symbolic deer, quite symbolic of what? Who could say? Perhaps of the creative act, perhaps of poetry. Certainly the mountains are described as sort of judging elders, so maybe there's that conflict in the poem. And he himself thought it was his best poem, and many people agree with him. And he also said he didn't quite know what it was about. So let me just read the opening 2 pages of this. You'll sense that that's a breaking out of something, but also breaking into something. Michael received an email from Andrew Mitchell, I think it was, saying that he felt that this poem was influenced by bagpipe music, by the pibroch. And I think Iain Crichton Smith had said that was the case, the theme and variations, and he called it fugal. I think it's a bit more rondo form than fugal, but it's a very interesting point, I felt. So here's the opening of Deer on the High Hills. 1. A deer looks through you to the other side, and what it is and sees is an inhuman pride. 2. Yesterday, 3 deer stood at the roadside. It was icy January, and there they were like debutantes on a smooth ballroom floor. They stared at us out of that French arrogant atmosphere, like Louis XVI sustained in twilight on a marble plinth. They wore the inhuman look of aristocrats before a revolution comes, and the people blaspheme the holy bells in the high steeple. Before the ice breaks, and heroes in spring come up like trees with bursting wrongs in their arms and feed the nobles to the uniform worms. So were these deer, balanced on delicate logic, till suddenly they broke from us and went outraged and sniffing into the dark wind. Difficult to say where they go to in the harsh weather, when the mountains stand like judging elders, tall on either hand, except that they know the ice is breaking now. They take to the hills, pursued by darkness, and lie beneath the starry metaphysical sky. Sometimes in a savage winter, they'll come down and beg like fallen nobles for their bread. They'd rather live in poverty than be dead. Nevertheless, there's something dangerous in a deer's head. He might suddenly open your belly with his bitter antlers to the barren sky, especially in winter, when tormented by loneliness, they descend to this road with great bounding leaps like the mind of God. In summer, they can be ignored. They crop so gently among the hills that no one notices their happy heads sunk in the feeding cresses. But beware of them now when ice is on the ground. A beggared noble can conceal a sword next to his skin for the aimless and abhorred tyrants who cannot dance but throw stones, tyrants who can crack the finest bones, tyrants who do not wear but break most ancient crowns. This poem's called Johnson in the Highlands. Rest assured it's Samuel Johnson. And Johnson went there in 1773. And there's a tension between the sort of Enlightenment man and the sort of folk traditions of the Highlands and perhaps Lewis itself. There's a reference to Samuel Johnson's famous black dog, depression at the end. And of course, Iain Crichton Smith himself suffered from depression, had a breakdown, in fact, in the 80s. And this is from 1965, this one. There's some ambiguities in the third stanza. I'm not sure about Mrs. Radcliffe. I think she's doesn't seem to be quite the right period, but wonderful poem nevertheless. Johnson in the Highlands. A reasoning mind travels through this country. In these sad wastes, a Londoner by choice sees water falling and some meagre deer. Examines with his tough, reasoning mind lochs, deer, and people. Is not seduced by Mrs. Radcliffe's green hysteria from a musical prose we've never once achieved, whose fences cannot reach between the words, whose arguments are broken backed with exile. A classical sanity considers sky. A huge, hard light falls across shifting hills. This mind, contemptuous of miracles and beggarly sentiment, illuminates a healthy moderation. But I hear, like a native dog notes beyond his range, the modulations of a queer music, twisting his huge black body in the pain that shook him also in raw, blazing London. So it's this, you shift from the dark to the light with Iain Crichton's method. So that's the dark, really. And this is the light. This is a poem I think that owes quite a lot to Wordsworth's The Solitary Reaper. He did like Wordsworth a lot, and Wordsworth's unavoidable, really. And it sort of prefigures poems like C.K. Williams' The Singing, for example. There's even a bit of Sassoon's Everyone Burst Out Singing, I think. Two Girls Singing. It's a lovely poem. It neither was the words nor yet the tune. Any tune would have done, and any words, any listener, or no listener at all. As nightingales in rocks, or a child crooning in its own world of strange awakening, or larks for no reason but themselves. So, on the bus, through late November running, by yellow lights tormented, darkness falling, the two girls sang for miles and miles together. And it wasn't the words or tune, it was the singing. It was the human sweetness in that yellow, the unpredicted voices of our kind. Yellow seems to have a special meaning for him. It becomes more positive as the poems go on. In fact, the whole book is a journey from darkness to light, you could say. There's much more joy and brightness towards the end. Ah, yes, he was a very funny man, I'm told. And the one time my wife and I heard him read in Dundee, it was a terrifically entertaining reading. But everybody says how funny he could be. And he wrote a series of stories about a character called Murdo, which are very entertaining. But as a performer, he was a great performer. He must have been a very entertaining teacher, actually. And I love this poem, The TV. He read that on the night in 1982 when we heard him. I remember him reading this poem. It's a little dated. It's from the 80s, I believe, this one. The TV. 1. The sun rises every day from moving shadows on the TV. 2. We did not believe in the existence of Ireland till we saw it many nights on the TV. 3. He knows more about Humphrey Bogart than he knows about Big Norman since he got the TV. 4. Said Plato, we are tied in a cave. That is the TV. 5. A girl came into the room without perfume, without expression on the TV. 6. At last he lost the world, as Berkeley said. There was nothing but the TV. 7. He bought War and Peace. I mean Tolstoy, after seeing it on the TV. 8. When he switched off the TV, the world went out. He himself went out. 9. His hands did not come back to him, or his eyes, till he put on the TV. 10. A rose in a bowl on the TV set. The things that are in the world, the things that are not. 11. He found himself in the story. He was in the room. He didn't know where he was. 12. You, my love, are dearer to me than Softly, Softly, than Sports Night with Coleman. 13. In locked rooms with iron gates. But my love, do they have TV? Yes, this is another poem that I don't think was in the collected, but I rather like it. It seems apt for our times. That collection it's from In the Middle, 1977. I think it's got some wonderful poems in it, but not very well known. But again, he produced such a vast amount. That's something perhaps we'll talk about later, just how prolific he was. And he would prefer to scrap a poem rather than revise it. He didn't revise it, or he revised a bit as he got older, but he revised very little. And some have criticized the work for that. But this one's In the Surgery. 1. What in this place are they waiting to be cured of? Headaches, insomnia, and the vulgar, small, unmentionable odors of the body. They're reading magazines, their heads bowed. They turn to the horoscopes and the love stories. A child with its loving mother gains their attention. It looks so healthy, as if no disease could get a grip of it or dull its blue eyes. They're waiting for the receptionist to shout their names. The question is, what are they suffering from? Is it death that is fixed in their bodies or a lack of life? 2. The receptionist has said no dogs permitted. On Saturdays, emergency cases only. Don't send for your doctor in the dead of night. He needs his beauty sleep like other people. The receptionist wears white like a starched angel. She's always speaking in the telephone. Is she happy here, bringing the ill together in the one room on such a fine day? 3. The doctor says, there's nothing wrong with you that a hunk of life can't cure. Meanwhile, I'll give you pills, which are red and black. Take 3 each day, eat plenty of oranges, and if you die, why, that's nothing. Plenty of people have died and been buried also. When you come back, we'll start all over. Meanwhile, good morning and stop worrying. 4. So I went away and stared into the water. People were passing by and some were laughing. They all flowed with the stream in their coloured clothes. It's true what he said. There's no cure for it. The new children are taught their alphabet, and the new mothers enjoy their miracles. What is in the water but more water? If you close your eyes, you hear the endless footsteps. One of his most famous poems is Old Woman, much anthologized in the Penguin Modern Poets and many another anthology. I wonder if he became sick of it, as many poets do with the most famous poem. But he didn't become sick of the theme, because he went on writing poems about old women. There are at least 12 poems with that title or a similar title, and some about old ladies, occasional old man. So rather than read the famous one, I thought read one of his last, which is looking back over the whole series. And of course, it goes back to his mother, who was a fierce Calvinist, and also all the old women on the island of Lewis, on the Isle of Lewis, because there were so many widows. They lost so many during the First World War. And then there was the terrible Isle Air ship disaster, where a lot of men were lost. So a lot of old women around, and also a symbolic figure, the hag of mythology. The old woman. It took me a while to push her down, the old woman dressed in black, into the graveyard and listen to the music of the wind, and learn to love the ripe corn and stubble and the voice of the young man who sang all day, and the horizon which cut the sky like a knife. And the rainbow too, I learned to love that lovely bridge which arches our fences, and the scholarly owl perched among trees. And avenues of trees, greenly shaded, and stones, wood, leaves, all these I learned to love, and to hate the honey colour of coffins, and old women telling black stories as they swayed in their unconditional dreams. Island, rise up and put on a fresh music. Put on your comic, not your mournful song about horses with heads like varnished fiddles and the Carcanet stones swathed in pink and blue. And I thought I'd finish, before we have a chat, with 6 of his short poems. Towards the end of his life, he wrote lots of short poems. He'd always written shortish poems, but he seemed to move more and more towards them. It's not uncommon among poets. I mean, Michael Longley's done the same, and I think Landor did much the same. Lots of short poems in old age. So here are 6 of them. I've just included 6 in this selection. Shorts. Drama workshop. This is what I tell them about drama. A stranger comes to the door, and the arranged plates fall off the walls. Grass. The grass streams all one way, but there is no denouement to which it points. Halloween. They stood in silence, then removed their masks. And below each mask, there was another one. Bus. There is no sorrow worse than the sorrow of seeing the last bus draw away from the curb. Horse. Lackadaisically, it stares down at the ground with its wealth of unbridled daisies. Death. Come in, tall skeleton, ladder of bones, fold yourself into a chair and have a small sherry. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. That was brilliant. And I hope I'm not the only one who's delighted by the fact that we had all these poems with Outer Hebrides and the microphone was picking up so much bird song in the background. I don't think that was from near me, but that was exceptional. I loved it. So essentially now we're just to have a little bit of a conversation about the book, about Iain Crichton Smith. But just a reminder, if you do have any questions that have come up, either about his life, his work, or anything else, then do put them in the chat. A little thing to say as well. I mean, it can be quite hard to imagine what life must have been like on the Outer Hebrides around about the time he was growing up. But there's one really exceptional resource. If you go to YouTube after the reading and you type in Eriskay, the Isle of Eriskay, Eriskay 1934, a German tourist with one of the early camcorders was going around the Outer Hebrides, and he's got about an 18-minute video capturing folk songs, you know, the lives of the islanders at the time. And I think it's just incredible, absolutely incredible to see. And it'll give you an even greater insight to Iain Crichton Smith and what he was producing at the time, because it was a hard place. But to bring us back to now, I suppose, do you want to start talking a little bit about, you know, how prolific he was? And do you have any sense of what he saw as a quality? What was the quality he was looking for in this poem, if it wasn't to do with shaping it or molding it or redrafting it? What was, do you have a sense of what he was trying to tap into, like, within his work?
He talked about the sparseness of the island, the bareness of the island being like the bareness of his poetry. His poetry became bare as it went on, really. So maybe he was sort of chipping away, trying to get at something. There's always that tension in the poetry between darkness and light. I think he was a poet who was very aware of the music, so he was sort of listening for something as much as anything else. And he doesn't quite have the sort of the sharpness of imagery that someone like Norman MacCaig has, in fact. Nor does he have the kind of the range of mythological reference you get in Edwin Muir, or the sort of the sacramental quality you get in George Mackay Brown. So something in between all those that he's working at. He thought the poems were provisional because of this whole business of the dogma and the Calvinist background. Poetry too, he thought, shouldn't be too rigid, and he broke out of the cage. He called poetry a cage in one of his interviews, and he was trying to to write something that was provisional. That's one of the reasons he didn't revise. It was almost a determination not to revise, because he didn't want to be in any way dogmatic. He didn't want to do anything fixed. So he was happy to throw stuff away. And that's why I've discovered all these sort of poems lying around that haven't been collected. But what he was aiming for, well, I suppose he was aiming for perhaps a spiritual, something spiritual, but that had almost been blocked off for him by his upbringing, by this very severe upbringing. So that's my feeling, that there's a sort of longing there. Ultimately, it was an existentialist, I think, but there was also a kind of spiritual something trying to get out.
There's just a follow-up question there, and I suppose it would tap in quite nicely about how perhaps, because you write really well in the essay at the back of the book about how he had two lives almost. He had the Gaelic, which was the language of the home, but then school, but also Stornoway, the town or the city, was the language of English. Do you have any sense, in your own opinion, how Gaelic shaped even his use of English,
Well, as I understand it, assonance is very important in Gaelic poetry, and so that must have shaped the way he wrote English. For those that don't know, he wrote in Gaelic as he wrote in English, and I'm told, he's an equally distinguished poet and novelist and story writer, playwright in both language. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, really. And you do feel. Who was it said? One of the reviewers said reading. I think it was Robert Bly said that reading Iain Crichton is like reading a translation, which is quite interesting. So the Gaelic must have affected the way he wrote English, and it did include some of his translations, his own translations of his own Gaelic poems, which are generally in a kind of prose in the selection. So you can sort of see for yourself, really, it's a different kind of poetry going on. Something he seems to let loose something more surreal in the Gaelic poetry, I think, as far as I can gather.
And what about the different? I was just going to say, what about the different shapes of the poems? Because again, there's a little comment there just referencing that, from different sections of the poems, be it the Gaelic shorts or TV poems, there you can go from quite you would even call them like micro narratives, I think, if you're being fashionable now, but something along those lines to much longer poems.
Yeah, very varied, and sequences. And the early work tends to be formal. There's lots of pentameter, but then he had these what you call micro poems. In fact, why do we hear that Gaelic shorts? Because that's one that you picked up. Was it Gaelic stories?
Gaelic stories, yeah.
You're going to read for us now, because you've got the right voice for it, for one thing. But also, I think it's a terrific poem, and it shows his. Maybe there's a Gaelic tradition of these short poems that he's working on. I don't know. Certainly the sort of, I suppose, the folk tradition is at work there. Yeah. It's a whole complex area that I'm not really qualified to talk about, but it is fascinating. Let's hear that poem that you chose for us. If we can see the text, that'd be great. Thanks.
Perfect. So there's 18 of these. What I'll do is I'll read the first 10, let's say, because that's the first 2 pages, just to flag that now. I mean, what appealed to me when choosing to read these poems was more, it seemed to tap into a couple of things. His love of narrative, and some of the poems, as you write, they say they do stem and branch off into more metaphysical elements, but he seems to be one to love the story in the poem, but also it's just the connection for poetry and people. And so we have these little Gaelic stories. 1, a fisherman in Wellington's and his sweetheart and his mother. A story about an old man and a seal. A woman reading a Bible for 7 years, waiting for a sailor. A melodeon, a peat stack, an owl, a croft, 2 brothers, a plate with potatoes, a girl from Glasgow wearing a mini in church, the sea and a drifter, the golden rose, a man who was in Australia coming home on a wedding night, a romance between cheese and milk. Glasgow in a world of nylons and of neon. You know, it's just, I suppose it kind of taps in as well to, you're right, is he can make a tune of things. And I think I'm being encouraged to carry on. We've still got the poems on the page, so I will get through these now then. So, two women talking in a black house, a monster rising from the sea. Will you take tea? A comedy in a kitchen with jerseys. A conversation between a loaf and cheese. A conversation between a Wellington and a herring. And then the last three, a conversation between fresh butter and a cup. A conversation between Yarmouth and Garabost. A moon hard and high above a marsh. But with these things, I mean, you do get the sense of somebody saying a jigsaw or something there. That's quite nice, but it's just the idea that not only do the images fit together, but the sounds are pretty much perfect. Like especially what the peat stack and an owl. You know, somebody who's got the ear tuned in.
Could have been written yesterday too. I mean, it's really a contemporary sound to it, and there's something musical structure. It's like a set of variations or sort of little Bach sort of, miniatures, and lots of some of them are quite opaque or mysterious. That doesn't matter. It's a bit of. I wonder if he's actually doing a Wallace Stevens there, sort of doing a kind of 30 ways of looking at the blackbird. There's a bit of that about it. Isn't there? And there's little bits of autobiography in there, which there often are in his poems. The Yarmouth, his mother was a herring girl, and down in England on the east coast in Yarmouth for a long while, and that haunts him. That image actually. There's one of his Gallic poems where he writes about remembering working on essays at university and dissecting poems and thinking of his mother sort of dissecting herrings and drawing parallels between the two.
How do you think he got on the islands? I mean, do you think he was like too soft for such a hard life, you know, or, you know, was there any sense of that when you heard him read? What do you think?
No, I don't really know how he got it. I think it was a love-hate, wasn't it? I don't know what people thought of him up there much either, really. We need a good biography, that's what we need.
You know, that's what, just to give a little private anecdote as to the type of world. My oldest brother was born in 1983 on the islands. And obviously growing up in the islands, it's windy and it's cold. And she went to see her mother-in-law to say, look, we've got this newborn baby, you know, how should we go about taking it outside? Is it too cold for it? Is the weather too bad? And the grandmother said, this is my own grand, it's okay, he's baptized anyway. As in, if he dies, he dies. It's okay, you know? So this is a type of, I mean, when we're talking about it being a strange and unusual place to grow up, I mean, that is exactly the world. And then you get this person who, you know, absolutely rightly goes against it, writing these poems. And you just wonder how on earth, yes, he reacted to the community and the community reacted to him.
Yeah, he was, I don't know, I think he internalized it. It came out in the poems, you know, being an artist. But the problem was, artists weren't welcome in that community, really, and were not understood. And I think he was horrified by many of the things on the island. I mean, there's an anecdote about his mother going with a friend to see a film about the starving millions in India or something, and as they came out, they were tutting and saying how terrible it was, and they realized they weren't talking about the starving millions. They were talking about the fact that they'd been showing a film on a Sunday or something like that, when they weren't supposed to. It was some kind of little thing. He got very annoyed about things like that, and anything to do with fundamentalism, really, and that fed into many poems about Ireland, poems about the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's a very fine long poem I've got just an extract from in the selected, poems about apartheid, any kind of sort of idealism, it turned him against. So it had that profound effect on him. whether I suspect when he was on the island, he was, courteous and just got on with it. But he moved away quite young. I suppose he was there until he went to university. In fact, he didn't see a train until he left university. It was quite a thought.
And also, I mean, in a few of his essays, he keeps referencing that one maybe first meeting with a homeless person. Yes. And this idea, it seems to have like almost existentially scarred him. It appears so often in his work. This idea of the person like almost out with the community, and, to be isolated from everybody.
Yes, that as he stepped off the train at Aberdeen, there was this homeless, blind beggar. And he had a great empathy, actually, for such people. He went on writing about the homeless and exile. I mean, his big theme is the exile. Mm-hmm. Perhaps that's one of the reasons I was drawn to him. Not that I'm an exile, but around the time I really got to know him, we'd been living in Egypt. And living in Upper Egypt, we're very conscious of the Nubians. We were living right in the south, now Swan, where the Nubians had been kicked out of their homeland because of Lake Nasser, and the Copts, who regard themselves as the real Egyptians, as well, and so their whole community. But so I sort of understood that feeling of sort of deracination, I suppose. How did I get onto that? What were we talking about?
No, I was going to say it's okay. We've got some questions here. I mean, this is perhaps more of a niche bit of knowledge if you have it, but we've got somebody asking, just because there's quite a lot of parallels with Peter Maxwell Davies in the Orkneys. Do you know, is there any sort of, did they ever meet? Is there any sort of connection there, or I suppose even just to branch it out?
I don't know whether he met Peter Maxwell Davies. Is that what they were? I don't know. He was very interested in music and knew quite a lot about music, the references to it, and I think he used to listen to Beethoven on his gramophone and so on. But it doesn't get into the poetry much. I don't know if he has been set to music much, whereas George Mackay-Brown famously, sort of Peter Maxwell Davies sort of spent much of his life setting George Mackay-Brown. And
how do you feel he kind of connected in with that Scottish scene at the time? Because you got George Mackay-Brown, you got McKay, you got McDermott, you got Garrioch. Someone
said he was sort of caught in the quarrel between Edmund Muir and Hugh McDermott. It's hard to place. So I think he is his own man, really, because it's such a curious background. The kind of poetry he wrote is unlike any other. I mean, it's very accessible, his poetry, but even at its darkest, and even when there are obscurities, it's always very readable, often very funny. There's nothing else really like him. So you've also got Solly MacLean. Now, he was very close to the work of Solly MacLean, translated a lot of it. And I think when he was given a copy of Solly MacLean's poetry as a prize, I think at school, that was a seminal moment for him. Right. Much more so than, in an interview, he talks about Hugh McDermott, and he wasn't very impressed with the ego and the way he sort of shifted. I think he said in his interview that if Scotland was offered independence tomorrow, McDermott wouldn't have wanted it, because he was a kind of contrarian. He would never have been happy. So I've not seen his thoughts on Edmund Muir. I don't see much in common there, really. But he had a lot in common with Gaelic poets and Derek Thompson, whose work I don't really know, but there's this poem to him, a lovely poem to him, which I included in the anthology, in the selected. He was very important to him. His work was very important to him. And the point I come back to, perhaps we haven't talked about it enough, about Iain Crichton Smith, that he's an international figure, I think, really, a European. Douglas Dunn said that he's a European poet, which he is, really. And he will refer to Dostoevsky and on the one hand, and Wittgenstein and whatever, and he's got an international scope, and that's a kind of determination not to be narrow, not to be made just this island poet writing elegies. I mean, the last thing he said you should be doing is sort of writing elegiac poems all the time, though he wrote a good few of them. But you should be able to write something new and forward-looking about your culture, which I think he did, really.
Well, I mean, you referenced it a few times as well. I mean, he does have quite a contemporary style to his writing and his different experiments in how he writes. And yet, I mean, even just before we started here, you know, we were mentioning the fact that he has slid from view quite dramatically in the way that a lot of that generation of Scottish poets have. I mean, obviously, we hope this remedies it, but I mean, is there any sense of why? I mean, is it, you know,
it's baffling, isn't it? Perhaps he was too popular, and that sometimes happens, isn't it? And it's just change. He'll come back. He won't go away. He certainly won't go away. And I don't think he has gone away in Scotland, really. I mean, I'm not sure his novel, Consider the Lilies, has been a sort of set text there for years. And I wouldn't be surprised if it still is.
Well, I was saying, you know, again prior that was actually a little bit of a problem, because I'd been able to Google for those listening. There's a really fantastic Norm MacCaig. I think it's an STV interview where he's sitting there in his study having a cigarette and pondering about life. And then anytime you go through and try and Google Iain Crichton Smith, all you're getting is SQA, how to answer the set question. You know, there's pages and pages, reams and reams of that. But no, I'd just love to. I mean, if only because I was trying to hunt down his voice. I've got this book here, and I think that's a fantastic 80s biography picture. But I just wanted to hear what he sounded like and how he got into his poems. You know,
he read incredibly well, but he read incredibly briskly. And with almost like a dismissive way, but great sense of timing. So there was certainly, and one of the ways I got to know Iain Crichton Smith was that was a Carcanet cassette, I think, of him reading. So maybe that should be reissued on CD or something.
Yeah, exactly. Put a CD inside the book cover. That's maybe an idea.
And there is a CD has been issued by someone, which I've got.
Or to be honest, even more to the point, I mean, the Poetry Archive or even the Poetry Library, I mean...
Is he not on the Poetry Archive? He should be on the Poetry Archive.
Again, I'm just saying, maybe, you know, it's important to get the voices there and to make sure Iain Crichton Smith is included, because, yeah, I think as quite a particular poet from a particular place with an accent all his own, it's so refreshing. I mean, one of my great... sadness is that I never got to hear Heaney in person. I mean, you can hunt it out afterwards, but I mean, from what you and Michael were saying earlier, he seems to have been quite a fantastic reader.
Yeah. And it's so easy with these poets to be, I mean, nobody thought to put down a microphone in front of Hardy or indeed Edward Thomas. So it would be lovely to hear these people. But I think we will always have his voice somewhere, and somebody ought to reissue them. You're right. Yeah, he was a good performer, and why is he disappeared? I don't know, because he's so accessible. I think he's one of those poets. If you pick up and start reading, you'll fall in love with the work. So we just need to get the books out there and people to realize how entertaining he was. I mean, he was a novelist and a playwright, a short story writer. He knew how to entertain people, so he knew how to structure a poem to give it tension and to carry you with him. But he also understood how a piece of music works, so placing things within a poem and making you want to go back and reread and get the architecture of it.
Just to return to the title poem, Deer on the High Hills. I mean, is that your personal favorite as well? I mean,
yeah, I think it is. I had a similar experience to the one that Michael described, and it is astonishing. It's quite a long poem, but it doesn't feel long when you're reading it. And it's utterly mysterious and utterly unlike anything else he wrote. And he was aware of that. He'd been reading a lot of Dante, apparently, and that comes out in the form. And he does all kinds of interesting things with the rhyme, as well as using these sort of little 3-line stanzas. And it's a poem that keeps on giving, because you're never quite sure what it means. But it never quite goes into Ashbury territory. You know, it's you all have a sense that it's something going on. So if you just want to read it as a wonderfully atmospheric description of the Scottish Highlands and the deer, which I think I probably did when I first knew it, then you could do so. But you can also start, interpreting it in other ways. And I think there have been books written about it.
We've got a question here as well,
right.
just asking about how do you feel his mental health issues reflected in his work?
Well, he hushed that up for quite a while, and it came out towards the end of his life, the fact he'd had this breakdown. And I suppose the poet that he most associate himself with was Robert Lowell.
Mhm.
And he appreciated that sort of sense of being in a sort of strict religious community, perhaps, but also the breakdown that he had. And it certainly comes out in the poems when once you know that he had these problems, you can see how it fed into the poetry. But he talked, I think it was with in the Jerry Cambridge interview. It was a wonderful Jerry Cambridge interview in the Dark Horse, where he talks about how he sort of moved out into the open sea. And
Is that when he left religion, left that kind of understanding of religion of his childhood?
that's right, yes. And he also said, I think he sort of joined the human race after he sort of after the breakdown, after that sort of, it was a kind of release, really.
I mean, do you think it was quite consistent then? I mean, this language that I use, like between light and dark and the different laws that's so prevalent in this poem, do you think that was a facet of his understanding of just like day-to-day life as well? That was a real underpinning of his, how he kind of understood the world?
Yes, it's almost maybe something with synesthesia going on with the colors, because he seems to use them very, very precisely. And you feel, well, yeah, what is this about yellow? What is it about these other colors? So that may be connected with the mental condition. I don't know. It's always quite difficult territory when you start talking about how, you know, sort of mental health feeds into the poetry. But he was a teacher, as indeed was I. So I sort of sympathise with how you can end up being knocked about a bit by that. But I think in one of those interviews he spoke about, it was the experience of living on Lewis, I think, and with a very, very difficult mother. His mother was just, you know, so strict, and what a strange life it was he led there. I mean, there were wonderful things about it, and the sea. He talks about the importance of the sea to him. And that was a kind of a healing presence. But he was sort of in exile from himself, though, in some ways. Here he was a creative artist, and he couldn't be a creative artist without being criticized on all sides.
Yeah, did he get married? Was it after his mother passed away that he
it
only
was around the same
married?
time, I think. It was around the same time. She was there a lot of his life, and is it 77? I think something comes to mind. Yeah. So and then things. I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to put this selected together, because those later poems, which are not reflected in the 1985 selected, which was the last one, there's an even wider range. And he does this wonderful long love poem, The Leaf of the Marble, to Donalda, his wife, visiting Rome. There's a poem about Tutankhamun's throne. There's all kinds of varied topics in those later poems. He just kept on expanding his scope. So the themes that he covered, the number of themes he covers are enormous, but it's always recognizably Iain Crichton Smith. Whereas I think there is this narrowness in the early poems, but a corresponding intensity to go with the narrowness.
And what there's actually a great question here. Just saying, I mean, how much do you see this as like John Greening's Iain Crichton Smith, and how much do you see these as like as like individual poems demanding their inclusion in the book themselves? I mean,
well, yeah, I started off with, I mean, this is what I started from the 1985, so and spun it around that, but I wanted to yeah, I'm English. Let's not hide the fact. So I've got no, I can't sort of perhaps I approach it differently. Yes, I will approach it differently. But I wanted him to be seen as that European figure, and I wanted to represent the later work and a fresher. You know, we everything looks different as time passes. You read poems differently. So I think, well, how do we see Iain Crichton Smith now? And I tried to make it an accessible and varied collection for the modern reader. But it's, yeah, of course, it's my taste that I try and explain some of that in my introduction. But I hope people will feel that they're getting the man, but not this man.
I think it's, I mean, his particular writing as well. I mean, you do get such an like a biographical bent on it, the fact that it starts with the poem on Lewis, and then it shifts through so many different areas of his life and his interests and his styles. I mean, I think he's a poet who didn't sit still. He didn't have his one particular interest or one particular way of writing a poem, you can flick through this brilliant book and just see so many different experiments and so many different kind of touchstones, books he's read or places he's visited. He's an incredible man for that.
Yes, and it was very enjoyable to edit him because of that, and also because there was so much to choose from. So reading it all through and discovering, I don't know, sure there's lots of other stuff out there, manuscripts and good as everyone else that's never been published, but so you can make quite a compelling book to read from start to finish if you want to read it like that way, or you can just dip into it. But yeah, I had to put in some old favorites and some that I hummed and hawed about that people probably object to. That was one about Kierkegaard I perhaps should have put in, but I didn't. Yeah.
I was going to ask as well, did you have much of a correspondence with him? Was he as effusive and, so many topics, if you had a conversation with him, or was he a little bit more islander and a little bit more himself to himself?
I never...
you never, sorry, you just attended the reading?
He died in 98, so
okay.
And I never actually, paths only crossed the once. I don't think I was introduced to him, because it was Douglas Dunn who was introducing the event. In fact, originally, you mentioned my book Westerners. We had been going to launch my book at the same time as Iain Crichton was doing his reading. That Douglas was going to do that, but we decided very wisely at the end that it was such an important event, because this was another selected poems was being launched, that I shouldn't be there. Not that I would have taken any of the glory, I don't think. That was that MacDonald selected, which was a wonderful, copious selected poems, which Robin Fulton Macpherson is called now, isn't he? Edited. Yeah.
Now we are
running out of time.
We're running out of time quite dramatically, actually. But I suppose just to say, look, it's been an absolute pleasure, speaking to yourself and also discussing this book, because so everybody to have one last look at it and just to promote it again, and just say, if you have any interest in what we've been talking about here this evening, then please do buy this book. I think it's a poet who deserves to be revived and to have a little bit more in terms of the contemporary readership. So I think we've popped a link there in the chat if you do want to follow it. But I mean, is there anything else you want to kind of round up with, or anything else you want to add on?
Just to thank you for your insights, and thank everybody for coming along. Yeah, do read him. You'll enjoy it. It's good antidote actually to the things that have been happening.
Yeah, no, I'll second that, and real pleasure, and thank you everybody for coming. I don't think there's anything else we kind of need to do. If there is, Michael, you're going to come back just to say goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm not sure. I don't seem to be able to see. Oh, here. Where am I? I can't see myself. But if you can hear me, I hope people can hear me.
We can, yes.
I just want to thank you both very, very much. I'm so thrilled that towards the end you mentioned Donalda, his widow, who was a wonderful character, who traveled with him when he came to Manchester, I remember. And in Manchester, we recorded that tape that you mentioned. Yeah. Thank you enormously. And it was so nice to have both your intelligence, Niall, and also your accent. So you scored twice. Please come and see us next week, the same station, same time, same place, when we're launching a first full collection, and a collected poems by the same poet. Her name is Jenny King, and Peter Sansom, who published her earlier books, and so did Peter Scupham early on. She's a lady with a very wonderful pedigree, but she's never put a book together before. We're going to be launching her collected poems on the 19th. So please come and hear us then. And again, to both of you, thanks hugely. And to our listeners, to our participants, as you're called on my screen, Becky will be putting up information about how you can buy the book at a discount. You can get 2 or 3 copies if you want, and spread it around. It is a really wonderful book by a poet whose work I adore. And I thank you, John, for editing it. Well, good night, everyone. Thanks.